So the title of the talk this morning is He Must Become Greater, I Must Become Less, as Lisbeth was just saying. And this comes from John chapter 3 that we're going to read in a minute, where John the Baptist is talking about his relationship to Jesus. And the purpose of this talk is to help us all to follow in John the Baptist's footsteps by living a life that's less self-focused and more focused on Jesus. So if we go to slide 1, Derek. So this is going to be the structure of the talk. We're going to talk about what John the Baptist meant by those words. Then we'll talk about how and why mankind has departed from these words very substantially. Then we'll come back to why we must return to the truth embodied in these words, and then how can we apply them in our daily lives. So, why did John the Baptist say the words, He must become greater, I must become less? So we'll start with a relevant extract in the Bible. Paul is going to read that for us. Have you got that?
So from John 3:25 to 30, an argument developed between some of John's disciples and a certain Jew over the matter of ceremonial washing. They came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testified about, look, he is baptizing, and everyone is going to him." To this John replied, "A person can receive only what is given to them from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah, but am sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him, and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater, I must become less."
Thank you, Paul. So I remember the first time I read this passage, those words, He must become greater, I must become less, really kind of hit me. It's like that sometimes, isn't it, when you read the Bible? Particular phrases just hit you really hard, and that one hit me. And they struck me as being really fundamental to our Christian journey. So in his magisterial commentary on the Gospel of John, David Pawson describes He must become greater, I must become less, as these great words. And he continues, "This is the secret of the Christian life, the secret of happiness. The only hope of being happy in Jesus is for me to become less and for him to become greater. It's also the secret of holiness. If I try to be holy, it doesn't work. I just become increasingly proud of what I achieve. But if I become less and he becomes greater, that is how I'm going to achieve holiness. It's the secret of effective Christian service and evangelism. If we are ever going to win anybody else, it's not by pushing ourselves, but by allowing Jesus to become greater and have centre stage." I'm sure, Michael, that's absolutely fundamental in your work, the evangelism that you're doing in Birmingham, that Jesus is front and centre, and that's why the successes that you've been talking about this morning are happening. You know, it's his power, isn't it, moving through people, and we're just the conduits for that. So just to give a bit of a potted history behind these words, the context for them. So the Jews had been waiting for their promised Messiah for centuries, and the excitement was building at the start of the 1st century AD, that now was the time when he would finally arrive. So when John the Baptist appeared on the scene and started preaching and baptizing people, many people started following him and calling him the Messiah. In modern day talk, we would say that John the Baptist was going viral. But despite all the adulation he was receiving, John the Baptist was adamant that he was not the Messiah, and he was simply preparing the way for the one who was to come. In the verse we just read, John the Baptist uses the analogy of a wedding, where he describes Jesus as the bridegroom and himself as the friend of the groom, or as we would say, the best man. David Pawson has an interesting analysis of what John the Baptist meant by this as follows. He says, "Nowadays, the best man's job is to get the bridegroom to the wedding punctually. But in the New Testament times, the best man's job was not to get the bridegroom, but the bride to the wedding. The best man had to go and propose." This sounds a bit challenging, doesn't it? If you fell in love with a girl and wanted to marry her, you got hold of a person, asked him, "Will you be my best man?" and negotiate with the family. The best man had to go and get a bride. Between the betrothal and the marriage, the best man was responsible for the bride's holiness, to keep the bride away from other men. Sometimes that was difficult. The best man was always relieved when he got the bride finally to the bridegroom punctually. So yeah, it's quite a responsibility, that role. Not just about giving a good speech on the day like it is nowadays. So in this analogy, Jesus is the bridegroom and we, his followers, are the bride. John the Baptist understood very clearly that his role was not to be the centre stage, but to bring more followers to Jesus and to put the focus on Jesus. And this is true for us as well. Our role is not to glorify ourselves, but to glorify Jesus and bring more followers to him. I read a story in the media last year, I don't know if you read this as well, about a best man who actually proposed to his own girlfriend in the middle of his best man speech. And he probably thought he was doing a very romantic thing, but we all recognise that it's a terrible mistake for the best man to take the attention away from the bride and groom. And he was rightly asked to leave the wedding immediately. So, yeah. So how and why has mankind departed from these great words and become self-focused? So the next slide, please, Derek. I mean, you may have other things to add to this, but of course, I think, as with all things, the journey down the wrong path started at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. So the direct reason for the fall was because Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate the fruit from the forbidden tree. I think we all know that. But behind that act of disobedience was a bigger sin, that of self-glorification. Adam and Eve sought to put themselves in God's place and be their own gods. When Satan, in the form of the serpent, was tempting Eve to take the forbidden fruit, he said to her, "You will certainly not die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The Life Application Study Bible has a really good commentary on this passage that explains where Adam and Eve went wrong and why humanity has continued to go wrong ever since. It says, "It wasn't wrong for Eve to want to be like God. To become more like God is humanity's highest goal. It's what we are supposed to do. But Satan misled Eve concerning the right way to accomplish this goal. He told her that she could become more like God by defying God's authority, by taking God's place and deciding for herself what was best for her life. In effect, he told her to become her own God. But to become like God is not the same as trying to become God. Self-exaltation leads to rebellion against God. As soon as we begin to leave God out of our plans, we are placing ourselves above him. This is exactly what Satan wants us to do. And because we are all descended from Adam and Eve, ever since then we all have within us the seed of self-centeredness, the desire to set ourselves up as our own gods. So now we move on to today's world. So far from correcting this original error, it's fair to say that in many ways humanity has compounded it, has doubled down on it. I'm reluctant to say that we live in the most self-centered society ever, because that might be said of any era. And certainly imperial Rome in Jesus' time seemed very corrupt and self-indulgent. But there are some specific trends in the West that have shaped modern society to be very self-centered. I mean, you may have others to add to this, but we've had 250 years of secular thinking being mainstream and then dominant in the West. It started in the Enlightenment. And this thinking not only rejects God, it seeks to put mankind in God's place, just as Adam and Eve did. It argues that mankind, through the power of his or her intellect and reasoning, can master not only his or her own life, but the world around them, and that we don't need God. And that is how most people sadly think these days, at least in our country. Then on top of that, we've had 50 years in which economic and social individualism has been very dominant as an ideology. So I'm not trying to be political here, but I think it's fair to say that economic policy has focused more on promoting individual wealth than it has on sharing resources more equally across society. And as a result, in recent decades, the gap between rich and poor has grown ever wider. There's been an emphasis on seeking self-worth through consumption, through buying lots of things. And some of the ties that bind us together in families and communities have weakened, with people living more solitary lives than they used to. And there is a real epidemic of loneliness these days. According to research, 1 in 5 young people, that's 18 to 34-year-olds, say they have only one close friend or no close friends at all. That's a really sad thing to think about, isn't it? Then on top of that, we've had 15 years of what I'd call digital individualism, in which social media has transformed the way in which many people communicate with each other. Of course, social media is just a tool, and it can and often is a way of connecting people. But unfortunately, it's become more and more a vehicle of self-centeredness. According to research, 80% of what people say on social media is just about themselves. And people use their social media accounts to showcase an idealized version of themselves, perfect pictures of them on holiday and, looking fabulous, not really necessarily authentic, real pictures at all, that makes them look more successful than they actually are, all to seek the approval and the validation of others. I remember once having dinner with a lady who spent as much time during the meal taking photos of her food and posting it on her Instagram account as she did speaking to me. So, needless to say, it wasn't the best dinner I've ever had, and I wasn't particularly impressed about that. But that is what a lot of people do these days. John Mark Comer, in his book Practicing the Way, describes the world we live in today as characterized by radical individualism. Not just individualism, but radical individualism. And it's hard to disagree. So the world in which John the Baptist could see his followers desert to Jesus and say, he must become greater, I must become less, seems so far away from our modern self-centered society. And to prove that now, or to illustrate that rather, Paul and I are going to do one of our funny role plays, funny in inverted commas, to illustrate how the scene that with John the Baptist and his followers might play out in the 21st century world.
Quick disclaimer. This is an acting performance. I don't necessarily agree with any of the views I'm expressing.
Yeah, we couldn't
Patrick
afford,
has written them.
We couldn't afford a real actor, I'm afraid, as well, so we had to just get Paul to do this. So, over to you, Paul.
Oh, I start. Right. Rabbi, we've just been looking at your Instagram account. You have lost 50,000 followers in the last week. Someone called Jesus is going viral and has now got nearly as many Instagram followers as you. His numbers are increasing every week.
This is a disaster. If I keep losing followers, then advertisers will no longer pay me so much to promote their products. And I may even lose my big brand sponsors, Porsche, Vodafone, Christian Dior. We need to stop this at once.
What can we do, Rabbi?
Can you find out more about what Jesus is doing? What content is he putting out on his Instagram feed that is so appealing? Which demographics is he appealing to? Then we need to make sure that we can beat whatever he's doing.
Oh, yes. Should I also start leaving some negative reviews about Jesus' content and encourage others to do the same? Maybe we could start saying that his content is not original, that he is a fake.
Yes, good idea. Do that. We need to do whatever it takes to remain number one.
Yes.
So, go off and do it. Well done, Paul. Thank you. A little bit of acting for the day. So these are the sorts of discussions that are happening all the time in boardrooms as celebrities, companies and brands battle for our attention and our money. So clearly we've gone down, humanity has gone down the wrong path in a big way. So why should we revert back to he must become greater, I must become less? Next slide please, Derek. So there are a number of reasons why we should go back to that truth in that saying and depart from radical individualism and self-centeredness. So there are probably lots of points we could make here, but I'm going to focus on three that strike me as most important. Firstly, it's what we're commanded to do. That's obviously always the most important thing. What does the Bible tell us to do? And, the first commandment makes it clear that we are commanded to put God first and ourselves, last. So Matthew verse 22 says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. In other words, we are to put God first in all things. And we are commanded to be servants and to be self-sacrificial. In Matthew 20, Jesus says to his disciples, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So secondly, the second point I want to make is he must become greater, I must become less, is not just an opinion or an aspiration, it's truth. God is greater, infinitely greater, and we are less, infinitely less. So we discussed this, I think, at a recent praise and worship meeting where we looked at the vast magnitude and wonder of the universe, didn't we? We saw those pictures and how small our planet is and how small we are in relation to the sort of vastness and magnificence of God's creation. So let's look at God and man side by side and ask who is greater and who is lesser. So next slide, please. So, and again, you may have others to add to this, but there is only one God, there are 8 billion humans plus those who have gone before. God is eternal. We have a very limited lifespan. God is the creator of all things. We are created beings. God is all powerful. We desire power and seek power, but we actually can't even control our own behaviours most of the time. God is all-knowing. We have very limited knowledge. We only know what we know, which is not very much. God is all-loving. We do love, but our love is imperfect at best, and it often goes missing altogether. God is all-holy. We repeatedly sin, hurting ourselves and others. God is all-seeing. We only have very limited vision. Jesus died on the cross to save us, and our sins put him on the cross. God's kingdom is heaven, which is perfect in all ways. Our kingdom is this world, which is marred by conflict, oppression, violence, abuse, greed, and inequality. So when we look at this comparison, how can we do anything other than fall on our knees and say, Lord, you are infinitely greater, and we are infinitely less. So we give ourselves totally to you. Come into our lives and transform us. What certainly does not make any sense to me is to look at that table and think that humans have all the answers or can have all the answers, and that we can set ourselves up in any way in God's place. Thirdly, God's vision for our lives is so much greater than any vision we could ever come up with on our own. Next slide, please, Derek. Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." As an example, recently in the men's group, we were discussing God's concept of marriage set out in Ephesians. And Paul and I have also been discussing this by reading the Tim Keller book, The Meaning of Marriage. I think we would all have to agree that God's vision for marriage is so much greater than mankind's vision of marriage. God's vision, based on mutual self-sacrifice between husband and wife, leads to deep love, harmony, and connection, and both coming closer to Jesus. Mankind's vision of seeking a human partner primarily to meet our own individual needs leads so often to disappointment, deep pain, and divorce. And I've been there, so I definitely know that feeling. So marriage is just one example. God's vision for our lives is far greater in all dimensions than our own more limited and self-centered vision ever can be. The self-centered path claims to be empowering and to offer us so much. It tells us that we can be whoever we want to be, that all we need is a positive mental attitude, that we can be the masters of our own destiny. Yet the reality of a self-centered society is so far from this. Spiraling levels of mental ill health, of addiction, of loneliness, of depression, of inequality. God's vision for our lives is so very much better for us because we were not made to be radical individualists. We were made to be his. So the last section now, we're focusing on what does this mean for our lives? So how do we overcome this tendency towards self-centeredness and start to live in accordance with he must become greater, I must become less? So I have a few areas that we're going to cover. Next slide, please, Derek. So how we see ourselves, how we see others, who will drive our life, how we use our time, what's in our heart as we do things. But this is just a selection. I mean, there are many more things one could add as well. So how we see ourselves. So basically, it means seeing ourselves as God sees us, not as we see ourselves. So if we don't know God, there are typically two ways in which we will see ourselves. Next slide, please. What I've called an arrogant view and a defeated view. So the arrogant view would include the following thoughts. I don't need God because I can work things out for myself. I'm the master of my own universe. I'm a successful person and I have everything I need. I'm a good person and have no need to be saved. I'm better than other people. I don't need the God of the Bible because I have my own concept of God. And I think we certainly hear people saying these things a lot. But there is also a defeated view of ourselves, which would include the following thoughts. God won't save me because I've done too many bad things. I'm a terrible person and ashamed of who I am. I feel inadequate because I'm not as successful or other things as others. I'm dependent for my happiness on the approval of others. I'm never going to be happy. And we may have a natural bias towards one view or another without God, but often we will flip between these viewpoints depending on how we're feeling and what's happening in our lives. But let us now switch to how God sees us, which is very different. Next slide, please, Derek. So, because of the fall, we have all inherited a sinful nature and fall short of the glory of God. So I think this keeps us away from the arrogant view of ourselves that we just talked about. But we are all created in the image of God. And if we turn to God through faith, we will become children and heirs of God, God's masterpiece, created anew in Christ Jesus, holy and blameless in his sight. And this takes us far away from the defeated view of ourselves that I just talked about. The Life Application Study Bible describes this very well. It says, "We will never be totally like God because he is our supreme creator, but we do have the ability to reflect his character in our love, patience, forgiveness, kindness, and faithfulness. Knowing that we are made in God's image and thus share many of his characteristics provides a solid basis for self-worth. Human worth is not based on possessions, achievements, attractiveness, or public acclaim. Instead, it is based on being in God's image, which gives us an unshakable reason to feel positive about ourselves. Criticizing or downgrading ourselves is criticizing what God has made." We all need to grow in our faith and in our transformation. We are all work in progress, but we are all made by God. And as Genesis 1:31 says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So an exercise we can do after the service, maybe in friendship groups or on our own, is just to reflect on how we see ourselves and whether there are times when we still hold either to an arrogant or a defeated view of ourselves rather than seeing ourselves as God sees us. So next we move on to how we see others. In short, we should see others as God sees them and not as this world sees them. This means that we recognize that all people are created equal in God's image and therefore deserve respect and honour. We definitely don't evaluate people on the things this world considers most important, appearance, wealth, status, etc. We are not to be hypocritical judges towards others. Do not judge or you too will be judged. But we are encouraged to exercise discernment with others, to recognise that the gospel and our own journeys with Jesus are precious things, and that we are not to give dogs what is sacred, and do not throw your pearls to pigs. So we are to exercise discernment and to help people on their journeys. And we should also look out for each other's spiritual gifts, because we all have them, whether we realise it or not. So again, an exercise we can do after the service is just to think about how we see others. Are there people where we may have a view of them that is not in line with how God sees them, either because we view them too negatively or too positively, and how can we shift our perspective of them to be more in line with God's perspective? The next thing is, who will drive your life? The American pastor John Ortberg uses the analogy of driving a car, which I also like quite a lot. He says that many people are happy having Jesus in the passenger seat, so they can ask him for help when they need it, with their health, their work, their relationships, etc. But he goes on to say, but not everyone is so sure they want Jesus driving, because if Jesus is behind the wheel, then we are not in control anymore. If Jesus is driving, he is in charge of our wallet, he is in charge of what we do, he is in charge of what we say. Ortberg concludes, I get out of the driver's seat, I hand over the keys to Jesus, I am fully engaged, I am more alive than ever before, but it's not my life anymore, it is his life. So we need to put Jesus where he belongs, in the driving seat of our life, not just in the passenger seat, giving us advice while we try to remain in control. So again, an exercise we can do subsequently is just to reflect on, are there parts of our lives where we have ceded control to Jesus, and are there parts where we've struggled to cede control, and what's stopping us from giving Jesus control of those parts of our lives. Nearly at the end now. So how we use our time. So how we use our time is quite a clear way of viewing how we are progressing with he must become greater, I must become less. Because we all have the same number of hours in the day, we all have some control over how we spend our time, and use of time is relatively clear and objective. We know if we've read the Bible today or this week or not. For example. Now already I can hear some of you thinking, hold on a minute, we don't all have the same amount of time and we don't all have control over how we spend it. For example, someone who is retired may have more spare time than somebody who is working, although some retired people are the busiest people you will ever meet. We might have some examples in this church for sure. And if we have a job, then we don't have a choice about when we work or often how much we work. And this is true. However, God-serving activities aren't and can't be limited to just the things we do in our spare time. God wants more than that, much more. So being busy is never a justification for giving less to God. As we have discussed before, often the most important things we do to serve God are on the front line, in our jobs, or when we're out and about, with our families or with our friends, or even if we're just out shopping or for a walk. It's on the front line. And broadly, we might distinguish between two ways of spending our time. One way which leads to him becoming greater, and another way which leads to me becoming greater. So next slide, please, Derek. So him becoming greater, that's time spent deepening my relationship with Jesus, telling others about Jesus, serving the church, motivated by love for Jesus, serving others, motivated by love for Jesus. Time spent on me becoming greater would include worshipping idols, our own pleasures and comforts, or activity that appears to be serving Jesus or serving others, but is really motivated by glorifying ourselves, which we'll come on to in a sec. So clearly, if we want to be deepening our Christian journey, we need to be shifting the amount of time we spend from the right-hand box to the left-hand box. And there are two main ways of doing this. First, we can change what we do with our time. So, for example, we might decide on a Sunday morning to come to church rather than play golf with our friends or something else. Or we might decide to read the Bible rather than spending the same amount of time on our phones watching TikTok videos. I know I have a number of examples of this in my own life already. For example, I read many fewer secular books than I used to, and I listen to much less secular music than I used to, apart from when my daughter is playing Taylor Swift. And instead, I read the Bible, which I never used to do, and I read Christian books and listen to worship music a lot more. So that's a good example of just switching out of one type of activity to another that's actually very similar, but is glorifying God. And then secondly, we can change how we do activities and what is in our heart when we do them. You'll notice that the table has similar activities that feature in both left and right-hand columns, depending on what's in our hearts when we're doing them. And this reflects that God cares not about really what we do, but about our motives for doing it and what's in our heart. So let's take a few examples. So two activities that appear to be left-hand column activities honouring Jesus are prayer and giving to the needy. I think we'd all agree with that. But precisely because these are recognised as virtuous activities, there is always a risk that people can do them, at least in part, to seek the approval of others and to glorify themselves rather than to glorify Jesus. And the Bible clearly warns against this. In the Sermon of the Mount, Jesus says, next slide. Please, Derek. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honoured by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners, to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So on the other side of the table, there are activities that might seem far away from Jesus, for example, our jobs. So if you're working in a county council, like Shami and I do, or I'm going to make a stab here, working on complex IT projects like Richard I've put. Is that a fair description of what you do, Richard? Ish? Yeah, supposedly simple IT, but made complex. So, but anyway, we've probably got the sorts of jobs where, I don't know about you, I often feel, how can I possibly bring God into my work? It seems so distant. Obviously, totally different for you, Mary. Your job is on the front line. It's very much serving Jesus. But when we're doing sort of office-related jobs that are not evidently serving Jesus, I struggle. I think, how can I possibly bring God into this? And I don't know if you have the same struggle. But it can be hard to see how we can honour Jesus at work. But Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So if we honour Jesus in our daily work by showing his care for the vulnerable, by being good servant leaders, then whole chunks of time will suddenly start switching over from the right to the left column because we're doing it with the right motivation, with Jesus in our hearts. So again, I think an exercise we can do after the service is to think about how we are spending our time in the week. And how much are we spending in the left-hand column and how much in the right-hand column? And how could we start shifting what we do and what's on our heart so that we're spending more and more time in the left-hand column? So final remarks. I just wanted to say, I hope in this talk I've explained why John the Baptist said the words, "He must become greater, I must become less," and why those words remain powerful and true today, even in a world that has largely rejected them. And we've discussed some powerful ways in which we can reorient our lives so that we can be more Jesus-focused and less self-focused. And there are some suggested follow-up activities that we can either do on our own or in friendship groups, which I think are on the last slide, just as a summary. Yeah, there we are. Yeah. So I'll just close with a brief prayer, and then we're done. So, dear Lord, we are so very grateful that despite your infinite greatness and our shortcomings, you love us and desire an intimate relationship with us. Help us to become less self-focused and to become more focused on you, so that you will become greater in our lives and we will become less. Amen. Thank you.